without any type of a pricing policy or really control over your distribution, what you end up having is what some people call the race to the bottom. I will say what most brands have is the form of a unilateral policy, even though they may call it a MAP policy. We're mainly focused on the US when we're talking about the laws around this, because most parts of the world, like EU, UK, Australia, any form of pricing policies, MAP, UP, whatever you want to call it, are illegal. You could have the greatest pricing policy in the world, but to your point, if you still don't know who Amazon seller Joe 123 is and where Amazon seller Joe 123 is getting products from, your pricing policy is basically useless, right?
This is the Digital Shelf Insider podcast of Antitrust. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Digital Shelf Insider, your no bullshit guide to crushing it on the e-commerce front lines. As we charge into 2026, I want to wish all listening in an epic new year packed with massive growth, killer strategies, and total domination of the digital shelf. Today, I'm pumped to bring on Michael R. Murphy. He's the partner at K&L Gates. Michael's a powerhouse in antitrust law, pricing strategies, distribution, IP protection, and tackling those brutal e-commerce headaches. And we're diving straight into the trenches. MAP policies, unilateral pricing policies, and branding protection tactics for today's cutthroat online world. If you're battling for better margins and that competitive edge, this conversation is going to be gold. Hit that subscribe or follow button right now on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple Podcasts, or whichever platform you're tuning in from, so you never miss these game changers. Let's dive in. Hi, Michael. Welcome to the podcast. Very thrilled to have you here. And I'm so excited to discuss today about MAP exclusively because we've never done an episode like this. And I'm sure it's going to be super valuable for our audience, which is brands in the space. And welcome.
Well, Shreshta, thank you for having me. I'm happy to be here. MAP is a topic that I love to discuss because, frankly, there's a lot of confusion over MAP, unilateral policies, what's legal, what's not legal. So I'm glad we're having the conversation.
Absolutely. So to begin with, let's just go back in time, like 2 decades ago, 20 years ago. We wouldn't see so many of brands selling online. The digital footprint wasn't large enough. And right now, when you see there's rampant price wars that's happening, so it's kind of the survival infrastructure for brands to have a MAP policy and the entire system in place. So if you had to break down why does a brand need a MAP policy in place in 2026, how would you put it?
Yeah, well, look, I think as people are listening to this now, right, just finishing up the holiday season and Cyber Week and Black Friday and a lot of promoing, right? I think it's really real for people right now. Without any type of a pricing policy or really control over your distribution, what you end up having is what some people call the race to the bottom, an unsustainable product cycle, right? But really strategically, the idea is for brands to be able to put a legal program in place, right, that creates sustainable and predictable dealer margins for their customers, right? You want your customers, your retailers, when they buy something from you today, to have the confidence in what they're going to be able to sell it for, 2 months, 4 months, 12 months, 18 months through that product life cycle of the product, right? And if you don't have anything in place, you have that race to the bottom where people get their hands on the products that don't really care about your brand, don't really care about your category, willing to make 2-3 points on a sale, right? The price starts dropping. all of a sudden your good customers who are actually investing in your brand, knowledgeable, start coming back, right? As we see all the time and say, hey, this isn't working for us. We need discounts, right? We need rebates. We need more co-ops. We need margin guarantees. Or, hey, let's come up with model 2.0 of this and start this unsustainable product cycle all over again.
Yeah. Uh, so, there's a fine line of difference between unified price policy and MAP policy. So, which set of brands really need to work with UPP versus MAP?
Yeah, so this is a great question we get all the time. And frankly, there's a ton of confusion over
Yeah.
what's a legal pricing policy, what they're called. I feel like every day I see people making up new acronyms on new
Oh,
policies and what they are. But in reality, there's two legal forms of pricing policies in the United States. Okay. One is a UPP, which is a unilateral price policy, and one is a MAP policy, which stands for minimum advertised price policy.
right.
What has happened, and I think it's mainly been driven by retailers and distributors, people love calling all of these MAP policies, right? That's like the street term, it's what everyone calls it. But there's actually legal distinctions between a MAP policy and a unilateral policy. I will say what most brands have is the form of a unilateral policy, even though they may call it a MAP policy. So, real quick, what the differences are. Unilateral policies, and I won't bore you and your audience with 100 years of case law, but unilateral
But we
policies,
want to hear.
right? But unilateral
Yeah.
policies, believe it or not, were created in like the early 1900s, right? 1919, I believe, was a case called US v. Colgate. That's why some people may have heard of pricing policies referred to as Colgate policies. It goes back to this Supreme Court case. And essentially, Colgate had a resale pricing policy. And what they did was they said, hey, listen, customers, we have a unilateral policy. You can resell our products at whatever price you want. However, if you choose to not acquiesce with our policy or sell it for prices lower than we set forth, then we have the right and the ability to stop selling you products moving forward, essentially terminating our relationship. At that time, this was novel, right?
Yeah.
And the Department of Justice filed a lawsuit against Colgate saying this is price fixing, this is illegal pricing under the Sherman Act, which is the main antitrust statute in the United States.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court over 100 years ago and still today recognized two independent rights. One is the right of a manufacturer. They have a right to choose who they do business with and who they don't. The other is the right of the retailers. They have a right to choose at whatever price they want to advertise and sell products. The Supreme Court put those rights together and held, listen, what Colgate's doing is legal as long as it's unilateral and not an agreement, right? So a brand can announce a pricing policy, whether it's resale or advertised price. Their customers are free to follow it, or the word the courts like to use is acquiesce to it or not.
Yeah.
However, if the retailers choose not to acquiesce, the brand has the legal right to cut off the supply of products to that customer or stop ship them. That's a unilateral policy, right?
Yeah.
In like the 1970s, what became popular in the United States is what I now have to call a traditional MAP policy, right? And we see a lot of the case laws actually around compact discs, where you would walk into a record store, which I don't even know if they exist anymore, and all the CDs were like $18.99 or whatever the case may be. They were a lot of tool of a MAP policy, but what a MAP policy is different than a unilateral policy. A MAP policy, which stands for minimum advertised price policy, right, is tied to cooperative advertising funds. But in order to fully be compliant under a MAP policy, it can only be the minimum advertised price, and there's some restrictions on what advertised means. But the only thing a brand can do is if somebody non-acquiescence with the MAP
Mhm.
is withhold co-op dollars. The problem this creates for a lot of brands, if you're selling through distribution or a lot of your customers, you're not giving co-op dollars, you end up with a pricing policy where you don't really have a stick for enforcement, right?
Yeah.
So, you know, there are situations where MAP policies work, but in general, most consumer goods brands, especially if you're selling through distribution and have indirect customers, some form of a unilateral policy is the right tool for you if you're going to adopt a pricing policy.
Oh, I really gotta frame this answer somewhere for everyone because it's so hard to find on the internet. It's so confusing out there. A lot of AI generated content, every other apps and platforms, just like ourselves, also creating content, but misinformation is real.
It is. And where it gets really confusing is what a lot of brands and people do, to your point, when they realize they have these issues, they go online, right? Now they're using Chat GPT or whatever. They see what their competitors are doing or people they perceive to have good pricing in the marketplace are doing. They take
Right.
elements of one, elements of another, they put it all together and they say, here's our MAP policy. It's going to solve all of our problems. A lot of times, what they're left with is a highly legally questionable policy that frankly
Right.
isn't that effective anyway.
Makes so much of sense. And this is exactly why they need to have a law firm at place to get things right.
Yeah, pricing policies are very high risk. If you do it wrong, it triggers the Sherman Act, which is, for lack of better language, I call it a no joke statute.
Mhm.
It's fines of up to $100 million for corporations. Individuals can be fined. There's actually a criminal element of it for willful violation. So it's frankly, nothing you really want to mess around with. You want to do it right. And if you do it right, it's perfectly legal and perfectly safe.
Makes sense. Um, but what are some of the non-negotiable legal elements that a MAP policy actually, kind of enforceable, not just something, just sitting within a policy, like you mentioned.
Yeah. So I just want to clarify one thing. Like, we're mainly focused on the US when we're talking about the laws around this,
Right.
because most parts of the world, like EU, UK, Australia, any form of pricing policies, MAP, UP, whatever you want to call it, are illegal, right?
Yeah.
Now in US you can do them. Canada about 10, 12 years ago tweaked their law so you can do pricing policies in Canada as well. Asia, it's a little questionable. There's not a lot of case law, a lot of antitrust law is new, but I just wanted to kind of set that global, footprint so people understand like we're really focused on the US law
US.
around that. Non-negotiables, what I always say is your pricing policy, because most likely it's going to be in the form of a unilateral policy, needs to be unilateral. We still see brands make this mistake. What does unilateral mean? Done or undertaken by one party. What's the opposite of unilateral? Bilateral or an agreement. Your unilateral pricing policy cannot be an agreement, right? You can't go to your retailer and say, hey, retailer, here's our agreement. You agree that we're going to keep selling you stuff. If you agree you're never going to sell product X below a certain price, that's a definition of illegal price fixing, right? So
Right.
you want to keep it unilateral. And frankly, we think that's pretty clear, but we see, right, people having, customers agree to pricing policies,
Yeah.
executing pricing policies. And frankly, it just unnecessarily greatly raises your legal risk.
For sure. Are online only clauses still allowed, like the price is hidden behind card reveal or promo codes or pop-ups? Like are authorities kind of tightening the rules around it?
Yeah. So here's the nice thing about, unilateral pricing policies. A brand has a ton of flexibility, in what the rules of the policy are, right?
Yeah.
some some brands I work with very strict, right? Like nothing allowed in the cart, right? No further discounts, no store wide, category wide discounts. Some brands allow some of that stuff, but they put guardrails up. The only caveat is the rules are the rules, right? And they have to apply to everyone. You can't have, here's the Amazon rule, here's the everyone else rule. Here's the, big guy rule. Here's the small guy rule. So, there's a lot of flexibility for brands in what the rules are. And frankly, in different verticals, different rules make sense, right? Like in some verticals, subscribe and save type of things are huge sales drivers. And you want to allow people to offer some discounting, but maybe you want to limit it to no more than 5% off that minimum price or whatever the case may be. And we work with, a lot of brands in a lot of different verticals, spending a lot of time on that business element of what do you want the rules to be? And then making that our policy, knowing that that's the rule for everyone.
Got you. So you mentioned rules are rules. So is it online exclusive or it applies to the offline stores as well?
It depends how you want to craft it. You can do an online only pricing policy. Generally, we recommend that we do a broader pricing policy, and it really applies to brick and mortar, and online, because frankly, it's gotten harder and harder. It's a term that frankly I'm not a big fan of, but omni-channel, and we hear it a lot from a lot of the retailers. Well, our pricing's our pricing online, and in store, it's the same. We can't deviate. I don't really think that's necessarily true, to be honest with you. But, look, there's not a lot of times where brick and mortar pricing can be super disruptive, but there are times it can be disruptive. It impacts one online price, which starts, as we talked about in the beginning, that race to the bottom that can be devastating. So, we try to draft it so it applies to both brick and mortar and online. But obviously, right, most of the disruption, most of the focus tends to be on that online pricing.
Right. So when we talk about unilateral pricing policy and MAP policy, when the violations happen, isn't it for MAP? I'm just trying to make sense of things.
Yeah. So it depends on what your policy is,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
if you have a unilateral policy, again, people even call those things differently. Some people say UP, some people say UAP, some people say UMAP, right? But generally speaking, right, and it gets a little confusing because most people who have a unilateral policy, what they have is a minimum advertised price, which happens to be the acronym for MAP. So,
Yeah.
look, I used to, when I started doing this about 20 years ago, like I used to get very hung up in what you're calling it. I mean,
Mhm.
look, calling it a MAP price, even though it's a unilateral, as long as it's done legally correctly, I'm not going to lose a ton of sleep over. I try to, persuade clients, if you want to call it a MAP, at least call it a UMAP, because that unilateral word is so important to the legality of what you're doing. I think it's very important to put in there. And look, you're not going to be able to fight it. Your customers are still going to always come back to you and say, hey, I need a copy of your MAP policy, or what's the MAP pricing? And like, look, there's only so much you're going to be able to do to get them in line with what it really is called.
Makes so much of sense. So when a violation occurs, what would be the cleanest legally defensible enforcement sequence, especially in perspective from 2026?
Yeah, great question. So I always say with any type of pricing policy enforcement, simple is better, right? There should be an internal system. Best practice is setting up an internal pricing policy team or committee to sort of review and handle these issues. As you can imagine, when you're involving the sales team and sales reps, nobody's going to want to cut off their account it starts creating some issues in how we're enforcing and what we're doing. So having a dedicated team who they're looking at these issues, they're making decisions. I still say the best real, mitigation of risk enforcement strategy is have a system where, an issue arises, there's a notification. I tend to call it a non-acquiescence notice or a warning. Then the committee reviews it and decides what action, if any, we're going to take and take that action, right? If you want to do 2 or 3 warnings, I can, swallow that and get behind that. But, we do see a lot of brands like sending a notice every day for 60 days and never taking action. And why I have concerns with that is under the law, when you have a pricing policy, threats or acts of coercion can take an otherwise legal policy and make it illegal, right? So, at some point, a brand needs to give a warning and then take action or not. This, and where brands really get in trouble is sales rep starts picking up the phone or sending fix your pricing immediately. You have 24 hours to fix your pricing or you're going to be terminated. What are you doing, you jerk? You need to fix your pricing in the next 6 minutes. At some point, courts find that those type of communications can take an otherwise legal policy and make it illegal.
Makes so much of sense. So, what sort of proof can brands bring in? Is it the timestamps when the violation occurred, or screenshots, or the audit logins? What exactly works?
Yeah. So, I mean, like when you're here's the thing, right? Like as a brand, you have a right to choose who you do business with and who you don't, right? And you have the ultimate discretion in saying whether someone's non-acquiescing with your policy or not, cutting them off or not. Now with so much software out there and so many software companies, and it's so affordable. Like, I mean, timestamps and screenshots of the acts of non-acquiescence, so easy to keep in store, right? It's kind of a no-brainer, but you don't really need or really want much more than that, right? Because it's only things that people can pick at and complain about. And God forbid, if you ever do get sued for anything, right? Like we always recommend actually on your sort of, UP committee team, putting in-house attorney or putting an outside counsel on it because, there's a lot of legal advice going into the decisions being made. And frankly, you protect those communications, through attorney-client privilege. So if somebody did sue you, right, you don't have to turn over documents where you were seeking true legal advice on what decisions to make. So, but yeah, best practice. I mean, obviously keeping the screenshot. If people ask, you can say, this was the issue. But beyond that, from a brand perspective, you don't really need anything else. And in fact, you shouldn't be having a ton of internal traffic about your pricing policy and your pricing policy enforcement.
Right. I asked you this question mainly because we work with brands for map monitoring and enforcement. And what we see is the large enterprise brands, they generally want to monitor on an hourly basis. And when it comes to the mid or the smaller brands, they're okay having a monthly system or a quarterly system in place. So I was just curious, like, what is the kind of cadence that needs to be followed when it comes to, sort of monitoring and keeping in track if there's any
Yeah.
violation happening.
And the cadence of like, how many times it pings, like, look, I'm not an IT expert. Obviously, I think a lot of people are always going to say like more data, the better, right? But there's a cost associated with that, right? The one thing I will say, like, the nice thing about multiple sort of pulling is, even though under your pricing policy, like non-acquiescence is non-acquiescence, and whether somebody's leading a price drop or following a price drop, it really doesn't make a difference if someone's in non-acquiescence. But I do think it can sometimes be important the more you're scraping to see who led the non-acquiescence in the price drops and who followed it, right?
Right.
Because I do think it's perfectly reasonable and legal, right, to take into consideration. If someone's leading a drop, maybe we, up a stop ship on them a little more than somebody who's following. It's still non-acquiescence. An action should
Yeah.
still be taken. But
Yeah.
if you have a customer that is consistently the leader, then I
Yeah.
think you need to have business conversations of, do we want this to be a customer anymore moving forward? Because they're creating a lot of the issues in the marketplace. So I can see why that may be important for certain brands.
So well put, Michael. Must say that. Uh, the next question I have is around Amazon, and a lot of violations happen there. Legally speaking, what options do brands have when a violator is operating inside the Amazon ecosystem?
Yes. So, this backs us up for me a little bit outside of like UP and map and pricing policy, right? And
Yeah.
in reality, what I always say is like the pricing policy is great,
Yeah.
but it's an element of a strategy you need to adopt. I wrote an article years ago called It's Authorization Stupid, right? It's a
Hmm.
play off of It's the Economy Stupid, which was a big, the Raging
Yeah.
Cajun, a big sort of political thing on, the outcome of elections and how important
Yeah.
the economy is. Well, it's authorization stupid. The key to any of this stuff, and frankly, the starting point, which a lot of brands make, is some system or some transparent authorized dealer network. You could have the greatest pricing policy in the world, but to your point, if you still don't know who Amazon seller Joe123 is and where
Mhm.
Amazon seller Joe123 is getting products from, your pricing policy is basically useless, right?
Right.
Where
Right.
brands need to start is designing and implementing some form of an authorization program, right? The key to this entire game is control and transparency. Building control and transparency over who's selling your products and where they're selling them, right? And what that is, and that can take a lot of different shapes and what authorization looks like based on what a brand wants to do, the channels they sell through, how they get to market. But at a minimum, a brand needs some form of an internet authorized reseller program where they're requiring authorization for anyone who wants to resell their products online, whether they're a direct customer, whether they're an indirect customer buying through distribution. They need to apply and be authorized directly by the brand. And that brand, through that authorization, right, can control not only if they can sell online, but where they can sell online, URLs, marketplaces, seller names, so forth and so on. Because I think what a lot of brands miss, pre internet, there was always this mentality of, well, the more dealers I have are going to equate to more
Right.
sales, right? And pre internet, it made sense, right? Like you wanted a store in the northern suburbs of Chicago and you needed to make sure you had a store in Stillwater, Oklahoma, right?
Yeah.
But the internet doesn't work like that. The example I always give, whether it's Amazon or Walmart on internet marketplaces, frankly, it doesn't matter if you have one person selling your product on that
Yeah.
marketplace or 1,000 people selling that product. A consumer is going to be able to find and purchase that product. The mistake a lot of brands make, especially for marketplaces, they over authorize and frankly, they start creating the problem they're trying to fix. There's only one way to win the buy box. There's only one way to get on page one. That's cut the price. And that's frankly the dynamic, right? We want to
Yes.
remove from the marketplace. And in the United States, right? The law is very favorable where you can arbitrarily choose who's authorized, who's not, where they can sell, what they can sell.
For sure. I like how you explained it with control and transparency. That's the end game for brands. Uh, I have a last question for you. For a brand trying to stay consistent and compliant in 2026, what would be the cleanest way to kind of protect price, keep that price integrity going without crossing the line into, price fixing or antitrust exposure?
Yeah, great question. One, and I talk about this a lot when I talk to brands, is you need to have an appropriate legal foundation in place, right? Because I can't tell you how many times over the years I'll get a call or an email. Michael, there's this website or this marketplace seller. Like, can you remove them? And my question is, okay, well, what's our basis, right? Like, I'm sure
Mm.
your people listening to this will hear when you send a letter, for sale doctrine, I can do whatever I want. I legally bought it. And that may be true if you as a brand didn't do the legwork to put a legal foundation in place. So it's having a properly vetted legal foundation, which usually consists of some form of an authorization program, right? Limited and qualified online dealers,
Yeah.
a pricing policy, and a system, right, of systematic monitoring and enforcement. Unfortunately, the unauthorized sellers are highly sophisticated. Frankly, more sophisticated than a lot of brands in this area, right? So you need to have a strong legal foundation, right? A system of monitoring and enforcement dedicated to constantly reviewing, sending C&Ds, learning, right, and uncovering where people are sourcing from. And this is what a lot of people miss as well. Taking that information and then going back and working with the business team to close up some of those leaks, right? Whether it's an international distributor doing stuff they shouldn't be doing, or maybe an overly aggressive promotional strategy, right? Or we see theft issues and tightening that up, or at least doing what we can. And also building in additional tools to create legal claims, right? Like one example I always give, and it's under trademark law, is if you properly set up an authorization program, you then can take your product guarantee or your product warranty and say it's only valid if you purchase from an authorized seller. Right now, that creates, under trademark law in the Lanham Act, a material difference of the product that an authorized seller selling versus an unauthorized seller, which gives you a claim under the law, right? So there's a lot of other little things. There's quality controls we can require out of authorized sellers. Sometimes it's vertical or product specific, but it's
Yeah.
part of spending the time doing the work to build that foundation. So the next time you call and are freaking out because someone's winning the buy box, we actually have the legal ability to remove that seller up to and through targeted litigations.
Absolutely well put. Uh, like having the legal foundation strong, then having a monitoring system in place, the authorization, and moving towards actionability. I think that's the goal for brands for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Look, there's probably a better way to say it, but,
Yeah.
with a lot of the unauthorized guys, sometimes you have to put a head on a stake, right? You have to be willing to, maybe file a lawsuit. When I have some clients that file a lawsuit every quarter, I have one client that over the last probably 6 months has filed 20 lawsuits, right?
Yeah.
Because, a lot of these unauthorized guys, they act like they're tough, but when they have to start spending money, and we have strong legal claims, they end up usually moving away, agreeing not to sell because, frankly, this is the problem with unauthorized sellers. They don't care about your brand, right? If you make it expensive or hard, they'll just simply move on and go try to destroy somebody else's brand and make a few quick dollars. And frankly, a lot of these guys will reach out to me because I've been doing this for so long, right? And I'll say, listen, I'm not trying to take your kid's college fund away. Just go sell somebody else's products, not my client's products.
For sure. Michael, thank you so much for taking out the time to join in. Very insightful session, and I'm sure this would be super insightful and meaningful for our audience.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you so much for having me.
Big thanks to Michael for joining us. It was a insightful section on MAP and unilateral price policy. There's a lot of confusion in this industry, especially looking out for credible information around these concepts, the new evolving terms. It's often very confusing. So I'm sure Michael's conversation has been able to give you insights into how this whole system works, having a strong legal foundation, working with a map monitoring or enforcement platform, and then driving results with actionability is what matters when it comes to pricing. And to end the show, I must say that there's a digital shelf optimization playbook of Metroscard that's out now. You can find it on our site. It's a very interesting one. We've like tried to cover in all the key strategies that a brand needs to look out for when they are trying to become digitally successful. So do take a look at that. I would also leave it in the show notes. If you like the show, do definitely give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and we'll see you next week.